Blood trickled down 12-year-old Thomas's back as the whip prepared to strike again, when a commanding voice silenced the crowd. "This not justice." The Apache warrior's unexpected intervention for a white child thief would forever change the fate of two orphaned siblings and challenge an entire frontier town's deepest prejudices. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on Redemption Creek, a dusty frontier settlement nestled between rolling hills and vast plains. The scorched earth cracked beneath bare feet, and the relentless heat seemed to drain life from everything it touched. The main street shimmered with heat waves, the wooden storefronts weathered and gray against the piercing blue sky. It was a harsh land that demanded harshness from its inhabitants, a place where survival often trumped compassion. Thomas Walsh stood in the shadow of the general store, his thin frame pressed against the rough wooden wall. At 12 years old, he was all sinew and sharp edges. His once round face hollowed by hunger, blue eyes too old for his years. The worn cotton shirt hung from his shoulders, patched in 3 places and still too large, a hand-me-down from better times. His knuckles were white as he clutched a small cloth pouch, fingernails rimmed with dirt from digging for wild onions in the creek bed. "Emma needs to eat," he whispered to himself, a mantra that had replaced prayer these past months since fever had taken both their parents, leaving them orphaned in a town that had little use for children who couldn't work. Inside the store, Mr. Holloway arranged peaches from a newly arrived shipment, their sweet scent drifting through the open door. Thomas could almost taste the juice, could imagine the smile on his 4-year-old sister's face if he brought one back to their lean-to shelter behind the blacksmith's shop. Emma hadn't smiled in weeks, her small body weakened by hunger, her eyes dull where they had once sparkled. Thomas drew a deep breath, wiped his palms on his threadbare pants, and stepped inside. The bell above the door announced his presence, but Mr. Holloway barely glanced his way. The storekeeper had made it clear that children without money weren't welcome to loiter. "Just looking, sir," Thomas said, voice cracking. "My uncle sent me to check the price of salt." Holloway grunted, turning back to his arrangement. Thomas moved between the shelves, heart pounding against his ribs like a frightened bird. He passed tools and fabric, tin cups and tobacco, approaching the produce with measured steps. The peaches sat in a wooden crate, their fuzzy skin blushing golden pink in the afternoon light that streamed through the windows. In one fluid motion, honed by desperation, Thomas slipped 2 peaches into his pouch. He turned toward the door, legs trembling, mouth dry. "What have you got there, boy?" Thomas froze, the voice like a bullet between his shoulder blades. "Nothing, sir. Just heading back to tell my uncle about the salt." Mrs. Peterson, the preacher's wife, stepped from behind a display of canned goods. "I saw him, Mr. Holloway." The boy took fruit. Thomas bolted for the door, pouch clutched to his chest, freedom just steps away. He burst into the sunlight, heart soaring with momentary hope, only to collide with the solid chest of Deputy Marshal Clark. "Whoa there, son," the deputy said, powerful hands gripping Thomas's shoulders. "Seems we've got ourselves a thief." "Please," Thomas begged, voice breaking. "My sister's hungry. She's sick. Mr. Holloway emerged from the store, face flushed with anger. "Caught him red-handed. 3rd time this month someone's stolen from me. Time to make an example." The deputy nodded grimly. "Judge Hawkins sentenced the last thief to 15 lashes. Reckon the law's the same for everyone, no matter the age." Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet, the stolen peaches suddenly heavy as stones in his pouch, the thought of his waiting sister like a knife in his heart. Word spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. Within an hour, townsfolk gathered in the dusty square, their faces a mixture of stern judgment and morbid curiosity. The wooden platform used for town announcements and occasional punishments had been cleared, its weathered planks bearing dark stains from previous justice. Thomas sat on a bench outside the sheriff's office, wrists bound with rough rope that bit into his skin. The stolen peaches had been confiscated, placed on the sheriff's desk as evidence of his crime. Each passing minute stretched his thoughts to Emma, waiting alone in their makeshift shelter, wondering where her brother had gone. "Please," Thomas said as Sheriff Benson emerged from his office. "My sister's only 4. She's alone and sick. She needs me." The sheriff, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard and eyes hardened by years of frontier law, paused. Something flickered across his face, perhaps doubt or pity, quickly replaced by resolution. "Should have thought about that before you took to stealing, boy," he said, voice gruff, but not entirely unkind. "Law's the law. Can't make exceptions, even for children." Judge Hawkins arrived wearing a black coat despite the heat, his thin face pinched with perpetual disapproval. He barely glanced at Thomas before conferring with the sheriff and Mr. Holloway in hushed tones. "Your Honor," Thomas tried again, rising from the bench. "I didn't." "Sit down," Deputy Clerk ordered, pushing Thomas back onto the bench. "Judge doesn't need to hear excuses from thieves." From across the street, Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, approached, cradling something in her arms. She stopped before the sheriff, her round face flushed with heat and hurry. "Found the little sister," she said, gesturing to a small bundle in her arms, "curled up behind Blacksmith Johnson's, burning with fever." Emma's tiny face appeared, pale and drawn, her dark curls matted to her forehead. When she spotted Thomas, she reached for him with weak arms. "Tommy," she whimpered. "Hungry, Tommy." Thomas lunged forward instinctively, only to be restrained by Deputy Clerk's firm grip. "Emma!" he cried, tears finally breaking free. "I'm sorry, Em. I'm so sorry." Mrs. Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, surely there's another way. These children—" "Step back, Mrs. Miller," Judge Hawkins interrupted, stepping forward. "The law must be upheld, especially in times like these. Stealing today, what tomorrow? Murder, anarchy." He straightened his coat. 10 lashes public square, then a night in the cell to reflect on his actions. A murmur rippled through the growing crowd. 10 lashes had killed grown men before, on a half-starved boy. "And the girl?" Mrs. Miller pressed, drawing Emma closer to her chest protectively. "The orphanage in Fort Simmons will be notified," the judge declared. "Until then, the church can care for her." Thomas felt his world collapse. The orphanage was 3 days' ride away. They'd separate them perhaps forever. "No!" he shouted, struggling against the deputy's grip. "You can't take her. She's all I have left. Please!" His pleas fell on deaf ears. Judge Hawkins turned away, and Sheriff Benson nodded to his deputy. Clark hoisted Thomas to his feet, marching him toward the platform where a post had been erected, leather straps dangling ominously. The crowd parted as Thomas was led through, some averting their eyes, others watching with hard expressions that spoke of frontier justice. Times were tough for everyone. Theft couldn't be tolerated, no matter the circumstances. As Thomas was secured to the post, his shirt torn open to expose his narrow back, he caught a glimpse of Emma crying in Mrs. Miller's arms. In that moment, he didn't fear the lash as much as the knowledge that he had failed the one person who depended on him completely. The crowd grew silent as Sheriff Benson stepped onto the platform, uncoiling a long leather whip. Sunlight glinted off the metal tips woven into its end, designed to tear flesh and leave scars that would remind a thief of his transgression for life. Thomas's thin body trembled against the post, his wrists secured above his head, pale back exposed to the merciless sun and what was to come. "Thomas Walsh," Judge Hawkins announced, voice carrying across the square, "you have been found guilty of theft from Mr. Holloway's establishment. The sentence is 10 lashes to be administered forthwith." Emma's cries pierced the heavy silence. "Tommy! Tommy!" She reached desperately toward her brother, tiny fingers grasping at air. Mrs. Miller bounced the child gently, turning away so she wouldn't witness what was to come. "Hush now, little one," she whispered. "Don't look." A few women in the crowd murmured discontentedly. Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher, stepped forward. "Judge Hawkins, surely the boy's age must be considered," she said, voice quavering but determined. 10 lashes will teach a necessary lesson," the judge interrupted. "Mrs. Jenkins, your tender heart does you credit, but the law must stand. Sheriff, proceed." Sheriff Benson nodded grimly. He'd never whipped a child before, and the reluctance showed in the tightness around his mouth. But orders were orders. He drew back his arm, the whip hissing as it sliced through the air. The first crack echoed like a gunshot. Thomas jerked against his restraints, a strangled cry escaping his lips as the leather bit into his skin. A thin line of red appeared across his shoulder blades, blood beading along its path. "1," counted Deputy Clark, standing to the side. Thomas bit his lip until it bled, determined not to cry out again. He thought of Emma, of protecting her, of their parents who would have been ashamed to see him stealing, no matter the reason. The whip whistled again. A second line crossed the first. 2. This time, Thomas couldn't hold back his cry. His knees buckled, body supported only by the straps at his wrists. Sweat mingled with blood, creating pink rivulets that ran down his spine. From the edge of the crowd, a figure moved. Tall and imposing, with long black hair woven with feathers and beads, he stood out among the settlers like a hawk among sparrows. Running Horse had come to Redemption Creek to trade pelts, an uneasy but necessary relationship between his Apache band and the white settlement. He'd been watching silently from outside the dry goods store, dark eyes taking in the scene with increasing disquiet. As the sheriff raised his arm for the third lash, Running Horse stepped forward, his moccasins silent on the packed earth. The crowd rippled with tension, hands moving instinctively to weapons. Apache raids were still a fresh memory for many. Running Horse paid them no mind, his focus entirely on the boy and the small girl crying for him. He'd understood enough of their language to grasp the situation. Orphan children, a desperate theft, a punishment meant for men being delivered to a child. "Stop," he said in careful, accented English, raising his hand palm outward. "This not justice." Sheriff Benson froze mid-swing, startled by the interruption. Deputy Clark moved his hand to his holster. "This ain't your concern, Indian," Holloway spat from the front of the crowd. "Boy's a thief." Running Horse reached slowly into a pouch at his waist, causing several men to tense. But what emerged was not a weapon, but a handful of trade beads, polished stones, and 2 silver coins. "I pay," he said simply, extending his hand toward Mr. Holloway, "for fruit, for boy's freedom." A stunned silence fell over the square. An Apache offering payment for a white child's crime was unprecedented. No one moved, as if time itself had stopped beneath the blistering summer sun. The town square hung suspended in an uneasy silence. Running Horse stood immobile, his hand still extended with the offering, his posture neither threatening nor submissive. The beads caught the sunlight, casting small rainbows across the dusty ground. Above on the platform, Thomas sagged against his restraints, the 2 bloody welts on his back stark against his pale skin. Judge Hawkins recovered first, drawing himself up with indignation. "This is a legal proceeding, not a marketplace. The boy has been sentenced. Step aside." Running Horse did not move. His dark eyes, calm yet resolute, shifted from the judge to the boy, then to Emma, still crying in Mrs. Miller's arms. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of mountains. "Where I come from, man who steals for himself loses honor. Man who steals for family, for child who starves." He touched his chest, above his heart. "This man knows sense, the way of truth. You punish boy who follows highest law." Sheriff Benson's hand remained on his whip, but uncertainty had crept into his weathered face. He glanced at Judge Hawkins, then at the blood already trickling down Thomas's back. From the crowd, Preacher Allen stepped forward, Bible clutched in his hands. "The good book says, 'Thou shalt not steal,' plain as day. No exceptions mentioned." Running Horse nodded slowly. "My people also have laws, given by Usen, Creator. First law is protect the innocent." He gestured toward Emma. "Is she not innocent?" The square grew tense with murmurs. Mrs. Miller, still cradling Emma, took a hesitant step forward. "The Indian's got a point," she said, her voice quavering but determined. "These children lost everything. Thomas was just..." "Enough!" Mr. Holloway's face had reddened with anger. "Are we going to let some savage dictate our laws now? Next thing, we'll be living in teepees and scalping settlers." Several men nodded in agreement, hands drifting toward belt knives and pistols. Running Horse remained unmoved, though his eyes registered each potential threat. He had come alone to trade, leaving his weapons with his horse on the outskirts of town, a sign of trust that now left him vulnerable. "I do not tell you how to judge," Running Horse clarified, his voice even. "I offer to pay. Trade is honorable." He extended his hand again, the silver coins catching the sun. "This more than worth of fruit." Deputy Clark looked uncertainly at the sheriff. "He ain't wrong about that, sir. Them Spanish silver, worth plenty." A new voice rose from the back of the crowd. "Let him pay." Heads turned to see Blacksmith Johnson, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron, his expression unyielding. "Those kids been living behind my shop for weeks. Boys been doing odd jobs, chopping wood, hauling water, never asked for charity, never took nothing from me." He jerked his chin toward Thomas. 2 more lashes might kill him, thin as he is. Emma had quieted, her tear-streaked face watching Running Horse with the pure curiosity of a child. She reached out toward him with one small hand, as if sensing something in him that the adults could not see. "Indian man help Tommy?" she asked, her voice small but clear in the tense silence. Something in Running Horse's stern expression softened. In his tribe, children were sacred, the future of the people. He had a daughter once, before the soldiers came to their winter camp 3 seasons ago. She would have been Emma's age now. "The law demands justice," Judge Hawkins insisted, though with less conviction. "If not lashes, then the boy must serve time. Thievery cannot go unpunished." Running Horse considered this, then spoke words that would change everything. "I take boy and girl. They work for me. Learn Apache ways, learn honor. This is punishment and mercy together." The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations. Take white children to live with Apaches. It was unthinkable. The crowd's reaction was immediate and fierce. Women clutched their children closer. Men stepped forward with hands on weapons, and a cacophony of protests filled the square. "Absolutely not," roared Mr. Holloway. "Give white children to savages. I'd rather see the boy take 20 lashes." "It's kidnapping, plain and simple," another man shouted. Preacher Allen raised his Bible high. "The children need Christian guidance, not heathen influence." Sheriff Benson raised his hands, calling for order. The situation was spiraling beyond his control. He glanced at Thomas, still bound and bleeding, then at Emma, whose eyes hadn't left Running Horse since he'd spoken up for her brother. "Nobody's giving any children to the Apaches," the sheriff declared once the noise had settled somewhat. "That's not happening." Running Horse's expression remained unchanged, though something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but a deep weariness, as if he'd expected this response, but had hoped for better. "Not take," he clarified. "Teach. Children return when ready." He turned to face Thomas directly. "Boy has courage. Apaches value courage." Thomas, dazed from pain and shock, lifted his head. Through the haze of suffering, he found himself looking into the Apache's eyes. Not the eyes of a savage, as the townspeople described, but those of a man who somehow understood honor and desperation in a way the others didn't. "What about my sister?" Thomas managed, his voice barely audible. Running Horse nodded. Sister, come too. Children stay together. For Thomas, those 3 words, children stay together, cut through everything else. The orphanage would separate them. The town had no place for them. But this stranger was offering the one thing Thomas wanted most. Judge Hawkins huffed impatiently. This is absurd. Sheriff, continue with the sentencing. Wait, came a new voice. Dr. Harrison pushed through the crowd, his medical bag in hand. He'd been out delivering a baby at a farm outside town and had just returned. Let me see the boys back before any more lashes are given. Without waiting for permission, the doctor climbed onto the platform and examined Thomas's wounds. These cuts are deep. The boy's malnourished and weak. More lashes could kill him or cause infection that would take him anyway. He turned to face the crowd. And what of the little girl? Who among you has offered to take her in permanently, to raise her as your own? The silence was answer enough. There had been no shortage of orphans since the fever swept through last winter. Every household was already stretched thin. Mrs. Miller, still holding Emma, looked troubled. My Henry would never allow another mouth to feed, she admitted softly. We barely get by as it is. Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher, stepped forward again. I could care for them during school days, but my boarding room is too small for children. The Indians' offer might be their best chance, Blacksmith Johnson said bluntly. Least they'd be together, least they'd be fed. You can't be serious. Preacher Allen was scandalized. Their immortal souls won't matter much if they starve to death, the blacksmith interrupted. Sheriff Benson rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. What guarantee do we have that they'd be treated well, that we'd ever see them again? Running Horse considered the question carefully. I give my word as Apache. Children will learn, work, eat. When next full moon comes, I bring them back. You see they are well, then decide. The proposition hung in the air. A month with the Apache in exchange for Thomas's freedom from punishment and the children remaining together. It was unprecedented, shocking, but also strangely practical. Thomas, finding strength he didn't know he had, spoke up. I'll go, he said, his voice stronger now. I'll do anything if it means Emma stays with me. Emma wiggled in Mrs. Miller's arms, reaching toward her brother and Running Horse. Tommy, go! Emma, go too, she declared with the simple certainty of a child. Judge Hawkins spluttered in disbelief. This is not how justice works. The boy doesn't get to choose his punishment. Sheriff Benson conferred quietly with Judge Hawkins and Dr. Harrison at the edge of the platform, their conversation intense but hushed. The crowd waited uneasily, the afternoon heat pressing down like a physical weight. Thomas remained bound to the post, consciousness wavering, while Emma had fallen silent, her feverish gaze darting between her brother and the tall Apache, who stood unwavering in the center of the square. Finally, Sheriff Benson turned to address the gathering. This situation ain't ideal, he began, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. But we're faced with 2 orphans, one of whom needs medical attention, and neither with prospects in Redemption Creek. He glanced at Running Horse, his expression guarded but not hostile. I've known this Apache to trade fair for 3 seasons now, never caused trouble. Judge Hawkins cleared his throat. The law must be flexible where circumstances demand it. Given the boy's condition and the unusual offer before us, I propose a compromise. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing the weight of the moment. Thomas Walsh will be released to the custody of the Apache for 1 month, the judge declared. He will return with his sister at the next full moon. If the children are well treated and the boy has learned his lesson, his sentence will be considered fulfilled. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers, but before protests could form, the judge continued, however, if the children do not return, or return harmed, the Apache's trading privileges will be revoked permanently, and the territorial authorities notified. Running Horse showed no reaction to the implied threat, merely nodding once in acknowledgement. "I give payment still," he said, approaching Mr. Holloway and extending his hand with the coins and trade goods. Holloway looked as though he might refuse, but under the sheriff's steady gaze, he grudgingly accepted the offering, pocketing it without a word. Dr. Harrison had already begun cutting Thomas free, supporting the boy's weight as he slumped forward. "Let me treat these wounds before he goes anywhere," he insisted, easing Thomas onto a bench the deputy clerk had brought to the platform. Running Horse watched with approval as the doctor cleaned Thomas's lacerations with whiskey and applied a salve that smelled of herbs and tallow. Thomas hissed in pain, but remained silent otherwise, his eyes fixed on Emma, who was now reaching insistently toward him from Mrs. Miller's arms. When the doctor finished, he wrapped clean bandages around Thomas's torso. "Keep these wounds clean," he instructed Running Horse. "Change the dressing daily. The boy needs rest, good food, and clean water." Running Horse nodded. "Apache medicine strong too. We have plants for pain, for healing." I'd be interested to learn about those someday," the doctor replied, surprising himself with his own sincerity. Mrs. Miller approached with Emma, hesitantly transferring the small girl into Thomas's waiting arms. "She's still feverish," she warned. "Needs willow bark tea and plenty to drink." Thomas cradled his sister against him, ignoring the fire in his back. "Thank you for watching her," he said, his young voice suddenly formal, as if he understood the gravity of what was happening. Running Horse waited patiently until Thomas indicated he was ready. With Emma still in his arms, Thomas followed the Apache toward the edge of town, where a painted pony waited, adorned with minimal but beautiful beadwork. Sarah Jenkins hurried after them, a small bundle in her hands. "Wait," she called. "Some clean clothes for the children. And a primer book, if you decide they should learn letters." Running Horse accepted her offering with a solemn nod that contained more respect than words could express. He helped Thomas mount the pony, carefully placing Emma in front of him, then took the reins to lead them on foot. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as the strange trio departed, an Apache warrior leading a horse carrying 2 white children heading toward the distant mountains that shimmered in the afternoon heat. "Lord, have mercy on those little ones," Preacher Allen murmured, clutching his Bible tightly. Blacksmith Johnson grunted beside him. "Might be the first mercy they've seen since their parents died." The sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains as Running Horse led his paint pony along a narrow trail invisible to untrained eyes. They had left Redemption Creek hours ago, following pathways through scrubland and sparse pine forests that appeared and disappeared like ghost roads. Thomas sat upright despite his pain, one arm securely around Emma, who had fallen into a fitful sleep against his chest. They hadn't spoken since leaving town. Thomas, unsure what to expect, divided his attention between watching the unfamiliar landscape and studying the back of the man leading them to an unknown future. Running Horse moved with effortless grace, his moccasins making no sound on the rocky terrain. Occasionally, he would pause, listening to something Thomas couldn't hear, before continuing with certainty. As twilight approached, Running Horse stopped beside a small stream sheltered by cottonwood trees. "We rest here," he said simply, helping Thomas dismount while carefully supporting Emma. Thomas's legs nearly buckled as they touched the ground, stiff from riding and weak from his ordeal. Running Horse steadied him without comment, then eased Emma onto a bed of soft grasses beneath a tree. He touched her forehead briefly, his expression revealing nothing. "Your sister's sick," he said, not a question but an observation. "Need medicine." Thomas hovered protectively near Emma. "What kind of medicine?" he asked, caution and hope mingling in his voice. Instead of answering, Running Horse began collecting wood for a fire. Thomas, uncertain what was expected of him, stood watching until the Apache gestured toward the stream. "Water good here. Bring some." Finding a small tin cup in the bundle the schoolteacher had given them, Thomas filled it from the clear stream. When he returned, Running Horse had already started a small, nearly smokeless fire and was crushing something between smooth river stones. "Give water first," Running Horse instructed. "Then this." He indicated the paste he was making from dried leaves and berries taken from a pouch at his waist. Thomas gently roused Emma, helping her drink. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glassy with fever. "Where are we?" she whispered, voice thin as paper. "It's all right, Em," Thomas soothed. "We're safe. This man is helping us." Running Horse approached with his medicine, kneeling beside Emma. For the first time, Thomas noticed the gentle care in the man's weathered hands as he offered the mixture. "Eat," he said to Emma. "Make fever go." Emma looked to Thomas, who nodded encouragement despite his own uncertainty. She obediently took the medicine, wrinkling her nose at the bitter taste. "Good," Running Horse said, his voice softening slightly. "Brave girl." He then turned his attention to Thomas. "Need to see back," he said. Thomas stiffened, but turned reluctantly. Running Horse carefully unwrapped the doctor's bandages, examining the wounds in the fading light. His face remained impassive, but Thomas felt the man's anger in the tightening of his fingers. "White man's justice," Running Horse muttered, more to himself than to Thomas. He reached for a different pouch and produced a yellow powder, which he mixed with water. "This stop pain. Stop bad spirits from entering wounds." The mixture cooled Thomas's raw back instantly, the relief so sudden he gasped. Running Horse rewrapped the bandages with practiced efficiency, then returned to tending the fire. As darkness enveloped their small camp, Thomas found himself facing questions he'd been too shocked to consider earlier. "Where are we going?" he finally asked. Running Horse looked up from where he was preparing a simple meal of dried meat softened in water. "To my people. Small camp. 3 more hours. Hidden from soldiers." "Why did you help us?" Thomas pressed, the question that had been burning in him since the Apache had stepped forward in the town square. Running Horse was silent for a long moment, feeding small sticks into the fire. The flickering light cast shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. "I had daughter," he said finally, his voice so low Thomas had to lean forward to hear. "And son, soldiers came to winter camp 3 winters ago." His hand moved unconsciously to a small pouch hanging from a cord around his neck. "No more questions now. Eat, then sleep. Tomorrow, much to learn." Thomas accepted the food offered to him, a strange mixture of dried meat, wild onions, and something that tasted like pine nuts. It was unlike anything he'd eaten before, but to his surprise, it eased the hollow ache in his stomach that had become so familiar these past months. As Emma slept beside him, her breathing already easier from the medicine, Thomas looked up at the vast blanket of stars overhead. He was a white boy in the care of an Apache, heading to a hidden camp in the mountains. Everything he'd ever heard should have made him terrified. Yet somehow, watching Running Horse methodically prepare their camp with quiet dignity, Thomas felt something unexpected taking root inside him. Trust. Dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when they resumed their journey. Thomas awoke to find Emma's fever broken, her small face peaceful in sleep for the first time in days. Running Horse was already awake, watching the horizon with the patience of a man accustomed to reading the land for both promise and threat. They traveled higher into the mountains, the air growing cooler as pinyon pines gave way to taller forests of ponderosa. Twice, Running Horse signaled for silence, listening intently before choosing paths that seemed to vanish into the landscape itself. "Soldiers sometimes patrol," he explained briefly. "We stay hidden." By midday, Thomas sensed a change in Running Horse's demeanor, a subtle alertness, like a man approaching home. The Apache stopped at a stream, helping the children dismount. "My people near," he said, "must prepare." From a small pouch, Running Horse produced ochre pigment, mixing it with water on a flat stone. With precise movements, he drew a single line across his own forehead, then looked at Thomas. "May I?" he asked, holding the mixture. Thomas hesitated before nodding. Running Horse painted the same mark on Thomas's forehead, then on Emma's. "What does it mean?" Thomas asked. "Shows you come with peace, under my protection." An hour later, they crested a ridge, and Thomas gasped. Nestled in a hidden valley below, a small encampment of perhaps 15 wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings covered with brush and earth, blended almost invisibly into the landscape. Smoke rose in thin columns from cooking fires, and in a meadow nearby, several horses grazed peacefully. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they descended the slope, figures emerged from the wickiups. Women paused in their work. Children stopped playing, and several men approached with expressions that ranged from curiosity to open hostility. An elderly woman stepped forward first, her face deeply lined by sun and years, her long grey hair bound with strips of rabbit fur. She spoke rapidly to Running Horse in Apache, her eyes never leaving the children. Running Horse replied calmly, explaining something that made the old woman's eyebrows rise. She approached Thomas and Emma slowly, studying them with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to look through rather than at them. "Grandmother says you have traveled far," Running Horse translated. "Not just in distance." Thomas, uncertain of the proper response, simply nodded. "Thank you for allowing us into your camp," he said, remembering his mother's insistence on good manners, even in the strangest circumstances. When Running Horse translated, something like surprise flickered across the old woman's face. She reached out gnarled fingers to touch Emma's cheek, then said something that made Running Horse smile slightly. "She says, small one has strong spirit. Will heal quickly now." A younger woman approached next, carrying a clay pot of water. Her eyes were cautious but not unkind as she offered it to them. Thomas thanked her, helping Emma drink first before taking his own turn. "This is Morning Sky," Running Horse said. "My sister. Her son Swift Hawk is there." He indicated a boy about Thomas's age who watched from a distance, his expression a mixture of suspicion and intense curiosity. The initial tension began to ease as Running Horse spoke with the gathered Apache, occasionally gesturing toward Thomas's bandaged back or Emma's feverish condition. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the tones of explanation, persuasion, and finally acceptance. "You stay in my dwelling," Running Horse told them when he returned. "Tomorrow, when you are stronger, you begin to learn." "Learn what?" Thomas asked. "How to survive," Running Horse said simply. "How to live with honor, how to be useful." He looked at Thomas directly. "Your people see you as burden. Here, everyone must contribute, even children." Thomas straightened, despite his fatigue and pain. "I can work. I'm strong." It was partly bravado. He felt anything but strong, yet the desire to prove himself was genuine. Running Horse nodded, something like approval in his eyes. "Good. Rest now. Tomorrow comes quickly." Days melted into weeks as Thomas and Emma settled into the rhythm of Apache life. Thomas's back healed quickly under the care of the tribe's medicine woman, who applied poultices of herbs and sang healing songs in the privacy of her wickiup. The physical pain faded faster than the memory, but each day brought new skills to focus his mind elsewhere. Running Horse proved to be a patient but demanding teacher. He showed Thomas how to move silently through the forest, how to identify plants that could feed or heal, how to read the sky for weather changes. The boy's hands, once soft from town life, grew calloused and sure as he learned to craft simple tools, repair weapons, and prepare hides. "Why are you teaching me all this?" Thomas asked one evening as they returned from tracking deer. his legs aching from miles of careful stalking. Running Horse looked at him thoughtfully. Knowledge keeps you alive, makes you valuable. He paused. And what is given must be passed on. Swift Hawk, initially standoffish, gradually became Thomas's reluctant companion. The Apache boy corrected Thomas's clumsy attempts at their language with equal parts mockery and genuine instruction. Their relationship transformed through shared tasks, gathering firewood, tending horses, repairing the camp's structures, until competition gave way to an unspoken camaraderie. Emma, meanwhile, flourished like a desert flower after rain. Her fever vanished completely within days of their arrival, and her natural openness endeared her to even the most skeptical tribe members. She followed the women as they worked, attempting to help with small tasks, soaking up Apache words faster than her brother. The ancient grandmother took a particular liking to Emma, teaching her to weave simple baskets and telling stories that needed no translation to captivate the child. "Tommy, look!" Emma would exclaim almost daily, proudly demonstrating a new skill or presenting a small craft she'd made. "Morning sky says I'm clever with my hands." The siblings slept each night in Running Horse's dwelling, where he would often tell stories as darkness fell. Tales of the Apache creation, of trickster coyote, of great battles and hunts. Thomas found himself entranced by these stories, seeing in them echoes of the Bible stories his mother once shared, yet with different wisdom. But as the moon grew from sliver to half to nearly full, Thomas became increasingly aware of time's passage. Soon they would return to Redemption Creek as promised. The thought filled him with a confusion he couldn't articulate. One afternoon, Thomas sat beside Swift Hawk on a sun-warmed rock, whittling arrow shafts as they'd been taught. The Apache boy worked with practiced precision, while Thomas's fingers still sometimes slipped. "You leave soon," Swift Hawk said in English, surprising Thomas. The boy rarely used the white man's language, though he understood more than he let on. "Yes," Thomas replied, unsure what else to say. Swift Hawk concentrated on his work. "You come back?" The question caught Thomas off guard. In the town's arrangement with Running Horse, there had been no discussion of what happened after the month ended. "I don't know," he admitted. "They might not let us." Swift Hawk frowned. "Why? You learn good. Little sister happy here." Thomas had no answer. That night, as Emma slept peacefully beside him, wrapped in a rabbit fur blanket the women had made for her, he watched Running Horse preparing his few trade goods by firelight. Soon, the man would lead them back to a town that had been ready to whip a child for stealing food to feed his sister. "What happens after we go back?" Thomas asked softly. Running Horse's hands paused in their work. "That is for your people to decide. And if they want to separate us, send Emma away?" Running Horse met his eyes across the fire, his gaze steady and certain. "Then we make them understand there is another way." The full moon rose like a silver medallion in the night sky as Running Horse, Thomas and Emma approached Redemption Creek. They traveled openly along the main road now, no longer taking hidden paths through the wilderness. Thomas sat straight-backed on the pony, Emma before him. Both children changed in ways more profound than their appearance, though that too was striking. Thomas's skin had darkened under the summer sun, his once bony frame filled out with lean muscle from weeks of physical work. His hair, longer now, was tied back with a leather cord in the Apache style. Emma, her cheeks pink with health, wore a small dress the Apache women had sewn for her, decorated with beadwork around the collar. Around her neck hung a tiny medicine pouch, a parting gift from the old grandmother. As the town's buildings came into view, Thomas felt his chest tighten with conflicting emotions. Part of him had dreaded this day. Another part had been counting the sunrises, curious about the town's reaction. Running Horse walked beside them, his face impassive but his eyes watchful. "Are you afraid?" Thomas asked him quietly. Running Horse shook his head once. Fear serves no purpose here. We fulfilled our promise. We return with honor." Word of their arrival spread quickly. By the time they reached the main street, townsfolk had gathered in small clusters, watching with expressions ranging from relief to disbelief to outright suspicion. Sheriff Benson stepped forward from the crowd, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Right on time," he said, eyes taking in the children's appearance. "Judge Hawkins is waiting at the town hall." They made their way down the street, followed by curious onlookers. Thomas spotted familiar faces, Mrs. Miller covering her mouth in surprise, Dr. Harrison nodding slightly in approval, Mr. Holloway scowling from the doorway of his store. The town hall was crowded when they entered. Judge Hawkins sat behind a table, flanked by Preacher Allen and several town council members. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the children, but he quickly composed his expression. "Thomas and Emma Walsh," he began formally, "you have returned as agreed after 1 month in the custody of the Apache known as Running Horse. This council will now determine your future placement." Running Horse stood tall beside the children, his presence commanding the room's attention despite the hostility directed toward him. "Before you decide," Running Horse said, his English careful and deliberate, "children should speak. They have earned this right." Judge Hawkins frowned but nodded reluctantly. "Very well, Thomas Walsh, you may address the council." Thomas stepped forward, suddenly conscious of how different he must look to these people who had once been his neighbors. But when he spoke, his voice was clear and unwavering. "A month ago, I stood in this town desperate and starving, ready to accept punishment for trying to feed my sister. I believed that was justice." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "With the Apache, I learned that true justice isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. It's about making things right." He turned to look at Running Horse with undisguised respect. "These people you call savages took us in, fed us, healed us, and taught us to survive. They treated us with more kindness than we found here after our parents died." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Preacher Allen's face darkened with disapproval. "Has the boy been turned heathen?" he demanded. "No, sir," Thomas replied steadily. "I still remember my parents' teachings and my mother's prayers, but I've learned there's wisdom in other ways too. The Apache taught me that honor isn't just in words or prayers, it's in actions, in how we treat the weakest among us." Emma, who had been clinging to Thomas's hand, suddenly stepped forward. "I'm not sick anymore," she announced to the room with a child's forthright pride, "and Tommy doesn't cry at night now. We help with work. We belong." Her simple declaration hung in the air, powerful in its innocence. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. "The children certainly appear well cared for. Better than when they left, I'd say." "That's beside the point," Preacher Allen insisted. "White children belong with their own kind. The territorial orphanage would separate them," Mrs. Miller interrupted unexpectedly. "After everything they've lost, would you take them from each other too?" The debate continued, voices rising and falling. Thomas and Emma remained standing tall beside Running Horse, who hadn't moved or spoken since Thomas began. Finally, Blacksmith Johnson pushed his way to the front of the room. "I've been thinking on this past month," he said, his deep voice cutting through the arguments. "Got plenty of space in my house since my boys moved west. Got a room going unused." He looked directly at Thomas. "Boy already knows how to work. Could apprentice him proper in the forge. Girl's old enough to start schooling with Mrs. Jenkins." A stunned silence followed his offer. "You'd take responsibility for both children?" Judge Hawkins asked, clearly surprised. "Seems the right thing," the blacksmith said simply. "And," he added, glancing at Running Horse, "I reckon they could still visit with their Apache friend when he comes to trade. Learn from both worlds. Might be useful, having folks who understand both sides." Thomas felt hope rising in his chest, so intense it was almost painful. He looked questioningly at Running Horse, whose expression remained unreadable to most, but Thomas had learned to see the subtle shifts in the man's eyes. "This is good arrangement," Running Horse said finally. "Children need roots in both worlds." He placed a hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder. "What you learned, you keep. What you become is your choice." Judge Hawkins consulted briefly with the council members, then rapped his knuckles on the table. "Very well. The Walsh children will be placed in the custody of Mr. Johnson, with the understanding that they'll continue their education and proper Christian instruction." He looked pointedly at Running Horse. Their association with the Apache, while not forbidden, should not interfere with their integration into civilized society. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Running Horse knelt before Thomas and Emma, speaking quietly so only they could hear. "Remember what I taught you about the hawk," he said. "It flies between earth and sky, belongs to both, fears neither." He touched the small medicine pouch at Emma's neck. "We are connected now, not by blood, but by choice, stronger bond." "Will we see you again?" Thomas asked, his voice catching. Running Horse nodded. "I return with each full moon to trade. Until then, watch the moon and remember you are not alone." As Running Horse departed, walking tall down the main street of Redemption Creek while townspeople stepped aside, Thomas and Emma stood with Blacksmith Johnson, watching until the Apache's figure disappeared into the golden light of the setting sun. "Well then," the blacksmith said gruffly, "reckon we should get you two settled." Thomas took Emma's hand, feeling the weight of all they had experienced and all that lay ahead. He thought of his parents, of Running Horse's lost children, of the strange path that had led them here. For the first time in months, the future didn't loom as a threat, but as a possibility. "We're ready," he said, and meant it.